Welcome to Year 2 of the Green Lectionary podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we will be looking at a text for the first week of the season of creation. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the season of creation is a 5-week period stretching from the beginning of September to the beginning of October, in which we make time to renew our relationship with our Creator and all creation through celebration, conversation, and commitment together. This episode was recorded by Charles Breton at the Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina. For you preachers, we will typically be using a text from the Revised Common Lectionary, but the Season of Creation has its own lectionary, which you can learn about at seasonofcreation.com. For this episode, we used a passage from that lectionary. My guests today are Josh Scott, pastor at Grace Point Church in Nashville, Tennessee; Karen Mann, pastor of Sojourners UCC in Charlottesville, Virginia; and Justin Cox, pastor of Second Baptist Church in Suffield, Connecticut. One quick content warning. There's a bit more swearing in this episode than we usually have. It's a hard passage that creates some passionate responses, and the Wild Goose Festival is a place where pastors swear. We will try to keep that to a minimum in our future episodes. So, join us now as we look at Romans 1 through the lens of creation justice. Welcome to this recording of the Green Lectionary podcast, which is a production of Creation Justice Ministries, an ecumenical organization that helps Christians to think about ways that we live in better relationship with God's creation. So the Green Lectionary is a podcast where we try to look at text through a creation justice lens. We are going to be looking today at a text for the first week of the season of creation. Many of you may not know what the season of creation is. It is a period between September and running through September to the beginning of October that is set aside for us to think about the ways that we live in better relationship with creation. It's a liturgical season which has been celebrated since 1989, and a lot of folks are still just learning about the season of creation, but it gives us a great opportunity to have some of these conversations about our relationship with God's good world. So, before we get started, I would like my panel to introduce themselves. So, Justin, why don't you start?
Justin Cox, pastor, storyteller. I work within I'm a small B kind of Baptist, but I want to preface that as I'm a Baptist who is Southern, but not a Southern Baptist.
And I'm Karen Mann. I am a pastor in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I am also a farmer. I've got a small farm where I raise mixed vegetables and have some dairy goats.
Josh Scott. I'm a pastor and a writer, and I once was a Southern Baptist. But God delivered me.
Amazing. Okay, so one of the things that I learned very, very recently is that typically what we do is a passage from the Revised Common Lectionary. However, one of the fun things about the season of creation is that it has its own lectionary. And so we've chosen a text, and by we, I mean I have chosen a text from the Season of Creation lectionary. And week 1 in year B of the Season of Creation lectionary gives us a handful of options. Karen is staring daggers at me right now, for those of you...
I hate the one he's chosen.
Well, there was a text from Genesis 1, there was a text from John 1.
My favorite.
But I chose the text from Romans 1, starting at verse 18, going to verse 23. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Josh, you are our Green Lectionary alum.
Yes.
So, where is creation in this passage?
Well, I mean, essentially, in this passage, creation is what Paul is using to say. It reminds me of Richard Rohr's line, which is something like, nature is the first Bible. Creation is the first Bible. But I just have to say, like, Bible nerd in me really just needs to preface this text. I did not have the same reaction, but I think the text needs context, which is Paul begins Romans 1. He's writing to a group of people in a church in Rome that is made up of Jewish participants and Gentile participants. And he's writing just after the Jewish participants were allowed to come back. In the 40s, the emperor expelled the Jewish folks from Rome. And so you can imagine this early Jesus community becomes predominantly Gentile, and then the edict is lifted, and now the community is way more diverse. And Paul's trying to hold it together, and he chooses an interesting way to do that, which is in chapter 1 to just trash the Gentiles, and then in chapter 2 to say, but not so fast. So it's just important to remember this, for Paul, this is an argument he's building. I think he's trying to pull everybody in to be like, yeah, aren't they awful? So then he can say, but actually we all have some stuff to work on. So creation's everywhere as a single standalone passage. Doesn't come off great.
Karen, Justin, jump in.
All I'll say is Derek sent this to us like yesterday evening. I had no idea what I was signing up for with the passage, and I was like, God, I have to preface this and say I struggle with Paul, and probably Howard Thurman's grandmother. There's parts of Paul that I don't need to read again. I'm just done with Paul. But then a lot of that I think is impacted by how I've heard Paul interpreted most of my life, and who has kind of had say and narrative over the interpretation of half a dozen or more of Paul's epistles that we know that he wrote. So. But my mother used to always say, and she's kind of like from that old Southern family of, you got to quote the chapter and not the verse, so context matters. And so you see, I guess I give Paul, which I should, right, like as a minister, a little bit of grace in that it's he's kind of giving shit to everybody, but then he goes back almost like the prophets of Hebrew scripture and saying, what it's not just them that I'm talking about. I'm also talking about y'all too. Yeah. And so that
very
comes
Amos-y.
in more in chapter, very Amos-y. And so I felt a little bit better about 11:30 last night when I was going over this and thinking about it. So I'll stop there.
And I'm going to go with you, Josh, on context, except modern context. So in a modern context, this passage is 3 verses away from one of the clobber passages used against LGBTQIA people, of which I am one. And so when I saw this passage, I was like, what the fuck, Derek? I don't want to talk about this passage. I don't want to talk about this passage. It has caused too much trauma in my life to talk about this passage, right? Even though we're not covering those verses, we can't ignore the fact that it is so close to those passages. And my first instinct when I read, I knew where it was. I knew what it was. I know those passages, right? I didn't even have to open my Bible. But when I read just the verses that Derek assigned to us, I thought, okay, I could talk here about how the people who are greedy and polluting and removing the protections for the environment and all of that are the ones upon whom God's wrath rests in here, right? They're the ones perpetuating the injustice. But then I have to remember that this passage is used to say, you are wrong. You are not the bearer of God's truth. And if I'm doing that, I'm no better than somebody else, right? So I want to draw some caution that we can't use a passage like this to condemn the people we don't like, in this case, climate deniers or whoever, right? Because passages like this have so often been used as weapons. So I want us to say, how can we look at this not as a weaponized text?
Yeah, and it's all of this is him making an argument that he's not in some ways making. Do you know what I mean? Like he's trying to bring the community together. He's not just going to trash Gentiles in their, polytheism forever, but just the way the scriptures end up being treated over the years. And by the way, when he sent it, I just saw Romans 1. I was like, shit. What? Because I wasn't sure exactly what verses he'd picked. And I was like, that seems like a weird climate discussion. But yeah, well done. Really.
So, the message here is that an easy way to lose friends is to have them on your podcast. Okay.
I still love you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask my question again. Where is creation in this passage, and how do we understand the ways that Paul is using creation in this passage, for good or for ill?
I want to expand the passage trepidatiously.
Of course you do.
To 16 and all the way to 25, because I think that helps. It helped me get a better feeling about the passage overall. So first, what he's saying here is about he's not ashamed to share the gospel. And for him, the gospel, the good news, is that God's power is saving and redeeming and healing. And that's what's happening in here. And then for the creation part, I found it interesting that later he says in verse 25, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator, who's blessed forever. And I wondered what people thought about that in context with this, because to me, at that point, he's using creature more like idol than previous. And that adds some context to the previous 6 verses.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I was first looking at this in that modern context, because I think one of the things that I learned in my seminary experience was, we have the term that I was given, or be very wary of, is don't eisegete the text, right? Like, be very careful, don't eisegete. And then I had a New Testament professor that was like, you cannot get out of your own way of your body and your experience. Like, you just kind of have to own that you are going to read a text a certain way. And so when I read this, and I'm like trying to, again, give Paul some grace, and like he's grasping at maybe what he's seen or what he's calling out. And so if I'm looking at this text, what I see, if we're dealing with the idea of idols, I was like, I wish, in a new modern translation, would they be talking about such things as like the idol of warfare, or the idol of assault weapons, or those things that kind of have our heart, or that idea of nationalism, patriotism, whatever you want to label it as, right? Yeah. And so I'm wondering, is that something that is going on in this text? He's like, he's looking around, he's seeing these things that are standing out that he can easily grasp, because when I read that, I'm thinking like, this is what I would say now. And so I guess that's where my thoughts went when I first, when Derek first said the thing last night. I was like, let me try to make sense of this as best I can through my own understanding.
Yeah, and I would say some of the idols that maybe not he's calling out because they're modern day idols, but the greed and the capitalism and the things that perpetuate the climate crisis are the idols that are carrying us towards that. Yeah.
And I love that he sort of at the end he deviates from this a little bit, but there's a section where he's sort of like, have you been outside? Have you looked around? Have you seen the world? And it's almost like, it almost has a very Mary Oliver vibe to it, like creation offers itself to you. And I love that for Paul in this passage, he sort of thinks like, yeah, if you've been in the world and you've seen how gorgeous and inviting and how creation cares for us, all the little lights on your dashboard should be blinking, that there's something bigger, deeper, beautiful, and profound behind all of this. That creation is a signpost pointing toward something that's holding all of creation together. Yeah. And I think that's kind of beautiful. He could have stopped there.
But because it's Paul, he didn't.
Kept going.
He didn't.
For many more chapters. Yes.
We're still in chapter 1.
Yeah.
We're still at chapter 1. So how are we being called to interact with creation in this passage, or how are we being called not to interact with creation in this passage?
Well, I think the calling is to pay attention to it. Because his whole argument here is like, you've been outside, you didn't pay attention. If you'd paid attention, you would have noticed that there's a thing behind the thing behind the thing. And I even think, the bit he does about idols, I think is a bump set Spike for the whole argument. Like he's trying to build this tension so he can resolve it. So I don't know that he's actually, I think he's saying don't worship creation. But then he's also comparing creation to God and saying worship gods.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do that? Where's the line?
Yeah.
And I just want to say, I love that panentheism is a really compelling way of understanding God to me. And so if God's the water and we're the fish, creation's the water, we're the fish, that just seems like a really, to me, a beautiful invitation. Like that's some language for God that makes sense when supernatural theism and all of that just no longer can do the job.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, when I was looking over this last night, I was thinking, like, okay, in my process theology circles, like, this is resonating, right? Like, this makes sense. I think one of the things that actually just kind of coming to me now, we call it, like, in the moment revelation, right, is the thing behind the thing. Like, so I can sit there and I can look at a flower, or I can look at a running river, and I can talk about it. I can write about it. I can carve something out of it. I can make art out of it, and it's probably never going to be as good as the natural thing, right? And so maybe that is that call for creation of, like, we mimic it and we talk about it and we can add to it, but going back to the source of it, that's a beautiful thing to stand. Like, I can talk about, like, staring into the vastness of the Grand Canyon, right? Or I can talk about the wings of a sparrow and what they look like. But if you watch something take off and fly, there is a divine mystery in that I don't know, that I can't fully capture. And so I don't know if that's what Paul's doing, but that's what I'm going to do with Paul.
I love that. So sunsets are one of my favorite things. Sunrises, I'm against. They happen too early. Sunsets, I'm pro. Yeah. And what always happens with a sunset, especially when you see a really gorgeous one, pink, orange, just like, you could sit down and say, you would not believe the sky was pink and orange, does not do justice to what that did to my insides. And there's a thing creation does that we can try to describe it, we can try to explain it, we can try to say, well, it tasted like this, and it looked like that, and it felt like this, but we're to talk about anything, we're in the realm of metaphor, because some things, unless you were in the body experiencing it, just cannot be one-to-one explained. So I love that.
Yeah, going back to what you said earlier, I think part of it is that we can meet God in creation, that God has revealed God's self in creation. And going back to I am not ashamed of the gospel, for God's saving power is available for everyone. And if God's saving power is the healing and redeeming of not only humanity, but all of creation, we can meet God in that place where we are participating in the healing and redeeming and saving of one another and all of creation.
I wonder sometimes in climate movements, particularly faith-based climate movements, if we run the risk of worshiping the thing and not worshiping God. Like, if we fall into the trap of worshiping the ocean, worshiping the creatures, worshiping and not taking that second step to the way that thing points to God. And it's a struggle that I've had recently with some scholars that I've been engaged with, who are really challenging the idea that sometimes we don't take that next step of the admiration of the thing to taking that next step to our admiration and love for God, and getting stuck and trapped in that. So I'm loving this conversation because I feel like it's helping us to balance that need for the appreciation and the love of the sunset, and say that sunset points me to the painter of the sunset. It's not the sunset I'm worshiping. And to your point, Justin, like, even photography, like, doesn't do justice for, like, I have tried so hard to take really good
how many of us I don't do the 4th of July that hard in our house, but like the kids want to see fireworks, right? And you take videos of fireworks and you watch them and like that looks horrible. Like that isn't who's ever going to watch this, right? And so it never captures like that moment or that splendor of something, of seeing it like with your own eyes and experiencing the sound and the emotion in it, right? And I think that's kind of along that same line of thinking.
Yeah.
Like you can do your best. I mean, and that's what we do. We see within Scripture a list of authors trying to describe how they understand the divine, and it's still like if they could name it, it wouldn't be all of the divine, right? Like it just wouldn't be like God would cease to be God if we could name God. And so
Right.
it just everything, at least in my experience, everything has just always fallen short. I'm like, God, I wish I could give you a better answer, or I wish I could give you a better view of this. And I always leave people wanting.
The thing sort of the conviction I've developed over the years is I know that I'm wrong often when I talk about God. My conviction is, though, I'm not wrong because I've gone too far and assumed God is too loving or God is too generous or God is too compassionate. I literally will have people tell me, you think you're nicer than God. I'm sorry. I think you have a theological problem on your hands if I'm nicer than your God. Because my conviction is that whatever the deal is, it's not that I've gone too far, it's I haven't gone far enough. I haven't given God enough credit for whatever the word God means, that reality that sort of is the thing behind the thing and undergirding the whole deal is more loving, more generous, more compassionate, more kind, more inclusive, more everything than I'm currently allowing it to be.
All of this said, where is there a call to action for the church in this passage, particularly around the season of creation and thinking about the ways that we as preachers or we as leaders in a congregation might want to bring our congregation's attention to God's creation?
I think I might point people to verse 22. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Because I think too often we assume that our point of view, our belief about this, our whatever is right, and we're quick to condemn all the others. And I think it's an important caution in there, especially as we take work around such a huge issue, that we maintain the possibility that the way we're coming at it might be wrong or not fully right, that we might not hold the whole truth of how to tackle the climate crisis or how to deal with any of these issues, and that the moment that we think we hold all of God's truth in that, we are fools. And
one interesting practice, because this will be in September, so it'll be a little cooler,
Yes.
a little more pleasant outside. The sun will be less angry with all of us. It may be an exercise to go outside as a community and do the thing Paul's asking for here, which is just pay attention to creation. There are times that this thing happens to me where I drive a certain path every day like everybody else does. Like you're going to a place, you could do it on autopilot. You could, anybody ever gotten somewhere and you were like, how did I get here? I don't remember the trip.
My whole life. Like 43 years.
And one of the things maybe that surprises me is when I'm not as distracted or I look out the window and I see something that has always been there that I've never seen before. And so maybe the invitation is to go outside and pay attention to the way the wind feels on your skin and the ground beneath your feet, and just to deep breathe and remember we are dependent on, we feel like we're this isolated, self-sufficient, and yet if trees got mad at us, we're in trouble. And so to just pay attention to creation, and then to think about what does it mean to be in a relationship with this. Because the initial human, our organizing myth is that people are created to be in relationship with the dirt and the soil and to be caretakers of the garden. And so what does it look like to take that seriously? You probably have to be in it. You probably have to know it. The people I know who garden, they know their garden. They know their field. They know when it's working and they know when it's not. They have almost a nervous system connection to the earth. And so, maybe it's that. Let's go outside, and today let's let creation preach the sermon.
I would say something around the idea of inviting people to see. So I'm a congregational minister, or I work in a congregation. I'm not in like a congregational minister. I'm a Baptist minister, but getting them to see that's different when you're in the Northeast. You got to make that distinction. It's the inviting people to see that God is already showing up in places all throughout their week, and not just on Sunday morning in this very fine, well put together space and sanctuary, right? And so if creation is the first testimony, and is the idea where God is first showing up, that all of creation is seeing what is happening. How are you going to get through a podcast like this around creation and not invoke Wendell Berry at some point? So I'm going to go ahead and throw a Wendell Berry thing out there. But like,
thank you.
I love this whole. I know we've been waiting on it. Somebody had to do it. But I love this whole idea of like, they're asking Wendell Berry and, the contrariness of the Mad Farmer. And they're like, God is dead. And he says, no, I see God every day down at the Kentucky River. And I see God often there. And I think it's, telling people like, you go fishing every week, or you go out and garden every week, or you go and feed your pigs every week. And there is this exchange of sacredness with creation, and you are part of that. And that in those moments are just as holy as anything that you're going to experience on Sunday morning during a program, right? And so if people ask me, when's the last time you saw God? I was like, I saw God, and she was chasing my 2 kids under a crabapple tree. And I felt that. And that is my story. And that's and I think that kind of lends itself to saying, like, I spot God, or trying to invite people to, like, you can spot God out within God's creation all the time if you're just looking. And I think that's the exposure and the call, right? The call to see that thing. It's not something that you're waiting for to happen. It's already happening. It's looking back and saying, like, oh yeah, I saw that already. I know where that's at.
Sort of like Jacob when he's in a certain place, which is just a great descriptor of a certain, like, nowhere somewhere, and he goes to sleep and he has this dream, this stairway to the heavens. And he wakes up, and my favorite bit about that is he doesn't say, like, I had the best nap and God showed up. Like, I don't know if you've ever had that kind of nap, like when God showed up. But he actually wakes up and says, God has been in this place and I didn't know it. And that's what you just described, is having your for me it's the beach. That's my, like, toes in the sand, water, and just feeling like creation, the ebb and flow of the ocean. Like this rhythm, somehow we came from that, right? Like, that's where we started, and there's just something primal and beautiful, and oh yeah, God was in this place, and if we screw this up, God will be in this place after we're gone. I would just kind of like to hang out with God a little longer in this place.
This morning at one of the sessions, somebody quoted Irenaeus and said, his line, the glory of God is a human fully alive. And I thought about that in the context of this, because the passage Derek selected ends with, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, idols, whatever we want to call that there. And I think about that as a message. Instead of, what if instead of the greed and whatnot that the ungodliness and injustice they're talking about here, it's that humans fully alive, and not just humans, but the non-human world, all of creation, that's the glory of God. All of creation fully alive. And when we see that, we're no longer worshiping idols of whatever number of feet. But that's the end of the passage for those who don't remember.
Very
right?
specific about the number of feet.
Specific, yes, right.
2-footed is fine.
Right.
You go 4, you're out.
Yeah, no 4-footed idols. Yeah, but yeah, if the creation fully alive, that's the glory of God. And when we're working towards that, right, then we are no longer worshiping idols.
Y'all are fucking around and going to mess this passage up for me. Like, this is actually going to be a good passage after this. And I'm like, damn, I don't want to feel that way about Paul.
No, it's still not. It's still not.
No, I win.
Well, so when I talk about the gospel, when I talk about the point of everything, I usually use 2 words. Like, the whole reason we do anything is for human flourishing, right? It's to help human beings, regardless of their religion or where they live or whatever. The goal of the gospel is human flourishing. We can't flourish as a species
if the earth doesn't
if the earth doesn't flourish.
Yeah.
And so to say we have hitched our horses and wagons are all hitched up together, and so if we want to flourish, then we have to tend to the planet, or we're in big trouble.
I think that is one of the, probably, we talk about wickedness and the idea of sin. That's probably one of the greatest things that I took away from like Fred Bonson, who helped start all this, was this separating humanity from creation. And we are part of creation, and we can't forget that. And so when we talk about like what is going on elsewhere, like that is happening to us too. Like we're not above that. Like we're just part of this bigger story. And I think that has like redeeming qualities as well, to be reminded of like you are part of creation. You're not above creation. Like you're here with it. And well, Brother River, Sister Tree, all that kind of stuff. Like that resonates with me. And I think that is helpful. And maybe, well, in the context of this text, I think I need that. I think I need reminding of that.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to open up to questions, comments for audience, for our panel. Anything? Anyone? Ogun. Always Ogun.
So I don't know if there's a question here, but
That's my least favorite way to start a question.
yeah, I know, right? I know. But I want to go back to when you guys were talking about the sunset, and you were talking about, sometimes we focus too much on the sunset and I think the phrase you used was the painter of the sunset. And you were talking about the beauty of the sunset and how it makes us feel. And I'm sitting there going like, yeah, but we know how sunsets work. We know why the sky's pink and all these colors. We know that it's not the sun setting, it's the earth spinning. The sun's not going anywhere. But also, the sun is hurtling through the universe, and we're spinning around the sun, and all of that makes up this thing. So it's like we're at this place where we can explain what we just saw. That doesn't make it any less beautiful, but we can explain it. So I'm sitting there going like, well, shit, have I lost God from the beauty of the sunset and creation and all these things, because we can explain it as a natural / scientific phenomenon versus this is the result of an unseen hand.
Yeah.
Sort of deal. So what would you say to someone like me, for whom when it comes to creation and nature, I have pulled those two things apart. It doesn't make nature any less important for me, and the preservation of nature, understanding my place in it, is minuscule. And to reiterate one of the last things you said, if nature don't survive, I'm not surviving. Right. So all that's true. So what do you say to the folks who might hold that view and then still kind of like hold faith in God over here, and those two things aren't meeting? Should we try to make a meet for folks like that? Should we just leave them apart? That's just where my brain went, and I'm throwing that there for you.
So I don't like to be prescriptive. There's no should, I don't think, in this. But I will say, we could talk to scientists about what is physiologically, psychologically, and emotionally happened to someone who's falling in love. And if they described it to you, you'd be like, doesn't sound too cool. To be in the experience of it is a whole different thing. So I think when it comes to like I'm fully on board with science. As a pastor, I feel like I need to say that out loud. I feel like I need to say that out loud. I know what we're seeing is not a sunset. We're just seeing a shift in the planet, right? There's dust in the sky. It looks gorgeous. It needs vacuuming. But I think the reason we end up, when we're talking about how it makes us feel, we lapse into the language of metaphor, because that's the only way to describe meaning. Science is great at telling us how things work, but it just doesn't explain to me why I feel a way about it. And so for me, seeing a sunset, knowing exactly how it works, I'm still like, well, that did a thing to me. And it feels like I can explain it better with poetry and not science, even though it's a scientific phenomenon, if that makes sense. And so I think, one of the things we veer off into in faith a lot is trying to make God and science connect. When sometimes maybe the language of faith is how we express awe and wonder about everything that there is. And so they're not actually, they don't have to be in conflict. Wonder can be the language that we use, metaphor, all that, to express like just how stinking great it is to be here. Like to be on this planet, to be alive. What a trip. And so I just think for me, I lapse into language that I probably don't even affirm. Because it just, meaning begs for a different kind of expression, I think.
I also
That was a good answer.
It was good. Great answer.
It's my first one ever. Thank you.
I also just want to. One of the things that we have lost in our modern scientific tradition is that a lot of the great minds that we think of in terms of science, and I think particularly of Charles Darwin, he did his work because of his faith. It was his awe of the natural world that made him start to do the research that he undertook. It was never in Darwin's mind that he would create a theory that would make people want to undermine God. Like, he would have been so upset by that. So I think that the conversation, I love what you said, and I think that the conversation between faith and science needs to be one of it needs to be more of a dialogue. It needs to be more. Actually, what you said really was great. It's really frustrating. Because
I'm never doing a podcast again. You just saw me peak. I think I just need to bow out now. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
But I think we need the language to express the awe and wonder of the scientific things that we have worked so hard to explain, and we need to get back to language that can reflect the beauties that we observe in our world, and
we have to get comfortable with contradiction.
And we have,
because the very thing I'm saying, what a sunset makes me feel, versus what it actually is a contradiction in some ways. But it's only a contradiction if you think everything has to line up and everything has to have nice, neat boundaries and straight lines everywhere. When I think what we need between our expression of faith and science is sort of an open border. Is a way of saying, I know science can tell me how this works. I'm not going to listen to Ken Ham on how creation works. If you don't know who that is, you're blessed and highly favored. But what I can do is I can learn about science and champion science, but also get into my feels, and when nature moves me, it is okay to say, yes, I know those are dust particles reflecting in the light, but damn, they're gorgeous. Yeah. And it makes me feel something. Yeah. And so I think we need to be able to hold. We've been so linear, so either or thinking. Yeah. When this is a both and.
Yeah.
Thank you. In your work to bring in nature, be aware of nature, appreciate nature, and perhaps that includes a deer, a raccoon in a creek, a hawk. Do you include the factory farmed animals who suffer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that a lot of us in this work have mourned and lamented is the ways in which we have turned animals into a product, and turned animals into just another consumer good instead of creatures that we get to share the planet with. So it's actually quite a bit of what we talk about, because there are, I think we know, and Karen,
Yeah, let me speak
please.
to this. Yeah,
I was about to, I should shut up.
Yeah. So I used to raise pigs for pork, not on a factory farming level. We did woodlot pork on our small property. I don't anymore for reasons that aren't important. But, I used to have really, really strong feelings about factory farming, and I still do. I don't think it's the right thing to do. I have found more compassion for the humans that are involved in factory farming, and I'm going to go back to what I started with, that anytime we cast judgment upon people, that we're putting our place in God's place, and that's not ours to do. I'm not saying factory farming is right. I would never choose to farm in that way. I think it's harmful to the animals. I think it's disrespectful. I think it's harmful to the people who eat their meat. There are lots of reasons I don't support factory farming, and there are real individuals who depend upon that for their way of life, right? And we need to remember that there are humans, images of God, who are involved in the factory farming of things. I used to work for a network of farms for refugees, and many of the folks in our program also worked at the chicken processing plant way north of Atlanta. And if they didn't have that job, they couldn't support their families. They needed that job at the Tyson chicken processing plant to support their families. Now, there was a lot of injustices involved in that system, and I would love to change the factory farming system, but I never want us to forget the real humans who are involved in that system, as well as the real animals who are involved in that system, and have compassion for the people who need those industries to survive. And until we create a new system where that is not true, right, we need to remember those people in that also. So total compassion for the animals, yes, it's a horrible way to farm for animals, and there are people involved in that also need our compassion.
And there are people who are depending on having somewhat of an affordable access to food.
Totally, yeah, on the other end of the line,
and,
yeah.
I mean, the ultimate problem, like, these things are symptoms of just an unjust systemic economic problem in this country.
Yes, totally.
Where people don't have access to affordable food, and they don't have access to affordable lots of things.
Yeah.
And keeping them in mind, I think is really crucial.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to read the whole thing, but Meatpacking in America is the name of the book.
Yes.
Nabhan
Yes.
niece. What's her name?
I forget.
Okay. The
Mary,
book
I
is called Meatpacking in America, and she does sort of a journalistic exploration of the meatpacking industry, specifically in Idaho. It's a really fascinating read. If it's something, if you care about those kinds of things, it looks at religion and meatpacking industry and how immigrants have transformed these small Idaho towns. It's a really fascinating read and gives you a different perspective on the human side of the factory farming thing. I don't know. Yeah.
I would just add, in my own experience, it was that kind of question about a relationship with food that kind of changed how I viewed creation care. And it started with something as simple as an egg. And, I grew up on a farm, and so my grandfather had hens, and so we would get those. And then as I got older, kind of part of the system, I would go and buy the $1.50 eggs for a dozen at whatever local grocery store. And then I had a class in seminary where it was like, have you looked at the inside of an egg lately and what that color is and what that means? And so have you seen how animals are treated in these large factories? And then, of course, not wanting to shame or understanding it's way more complex, dealing with people who are, trying to hold a job and support a family. But going in and seeing how the color of a yolk is this, again, this divine mystery of God, this color of it that is so beautiful compared to something that is injected with all kind of stuff, that is mass produced, that these poor animals are like, their beaks are shaved down so they can be in confined spaces. And all of a sudden that $1.50 to $5 to $6 for a dozen eggs, that became something that in my family, which still experiences a lot of privilege, that was an expense that I was like, this is a starting point for me. And this is how I am interacting with creation. Like, I can spend that much money to know that there is there's good treatment, fair treatment of these animals. I know they are free range and they are loved, and I know my local farmer. And even on that, just building a relationship with someone else in my community who I know where my eggs come from. That was just like, it was such a small step, but it catapulted me into like this whole realm of theology that I hadn't even touched yet. And,
100%.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I miss the pork chops from my pigs so much. There is nothing as good as those. I think when I was on your other podcast a while ago, you asked me what gave me hope, and I said pork chops. So I'm 100% in on humane animal raising, and supporting your local farmer and all of that. And having been a local farmer at the farmers market selling pork chops for $12 a pound, most of my community cannot afford to eat my pork chops.
Yep.
And I can't afford to sell it for any less.
I will say in those spaces, I say I'm a storyteller. So when I sit down with those $12 pork chops, I always tell the story. And I tell them where I got it from. So it's not just like I'm eating this. Like, let me tell you where I got this from. Like, because I'm really excited about that. And not like in a Portlandia kind of way of like, I know the chicken's name and we had this really close relationship. I'm not going through all that. But I get to say like, hey, I know this family who is, has this small farm in, Connecticut where I go and I know their children's names. And we go to the library together and we do all these things. And the meal, or just that small, just the damn egg, becomes something so much bigger, and it invites people to see that what they put on their table has meaning. So the storytelling aspect is what I get excited about.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Charles is giving me the signal. So, just
Is he doing this? I can't see.
oh man,
He's doing this.
I'm so glad I have so many friends. Justin Cox, Karen Mann, Josh Scott, thank you so much for doing this. Everyone, let's give them a hand. Green Lectionary podcast you can find anywhere that you get your podcasts. Check out the Creation Justice Ministries table. We have some good stuff over there. Grab a Green Lectionary sticker and put it on somebody else's property, because that's a fun thing to do. All right, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for joining us for Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Derek Weston, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and help us spread the word with a good review. Leave us a comment and let us know how you've used the show and how you can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.